Our speaker tonight is Sonia Perillo. She is the Executive Director of Arizona Audubon. She became Executive Director in March of 2016. She's worked in the field of land conservation for nearly 20 years, most recently as the Executive Director of the Desert Foothills Land Trust. And she is also serves as the Vice Chair of the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits and Chair of their Nonprofit Policy Council, and as a member of the Management Board of the Sonoran Joint Venture. Her roots in Arizona begin in college with repairing restoration work on the lower Colorado River for the Colorado River Indian tribes. She lives in North Phoenix with her husband Adam, daughter Sophie, and a menagerie of poorly trained pets. And the name of her presentation tonight is Where Birds Thrive, People Prosper.
Thank you. All right, the mic's on. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I am particularly grateful to you for bringing me up here in the fall when I could enjoy some fall color, because we don't have that down in Phoenix right now. So really thrilled to be here with you tonight. Also want to make a plug for the dinner in December. I was able to attend last year and had such a good time. I just put it in my calendar to come back this year, so I'm going to try to pull it off. It was a really great time, so it's good to see many of you again. I am going to spend a little bit of time talking through National Audubon Society and Audubon Arizona's sort of strategic work in Arizona, and I'm going to try to contextualize that, make it relevant for us here in Arizona, because some of the things we talk about at National Audubon are these big lofty issues, climate change and water conservation, and so what does that really mean for us on the ground in Arizona? So that's what I'm going to focus on this evening, and I'm making use of wonderful bird photos. So, will it turn? Yes. So the first thing I want to share is, I'm not sure if everybody knows that National Audubon Society changed our mission statement about a year ago. And I really love it. I actually often stop at the first two lines. We are working to protect birds in the places they need. Like, that really tells people the fundamental aspect of the conservation work that Audubon is doing. We go on to explain some of the ways that we do it through science, through advocacy, through education, through on-the-ground conservation. But fundamentally, we use the lens of birds to guide our conservation work, as do you. We do this in a way that makes, Audubon says we are local everywhere, and this is why. So we organize ourselves by flyways, the same way that our birds travel, and we are in the central flyway, so that big mass of land. We are the biggest and best flyway, we believe. And within Arizona, there are 8 chapters. There is a nature center down in Phoenix. I invite you all to visit us. Our state office is housed there. We also have, how many of you know about Appleton Wattel Research Ranch in southern Arizona? Just a handful. So there's a biological field station in southern Arizona that Audubon has been operating since 1980. So I'm going to come back to that one in a little while. But it's this network, the chapters, 453, I believe, chapters across the country, the nature centers who see 1 million people a year. It's that network that really gives Audubon the power to influence bird conservation across the hemisphere. Ooh, maybe? I'm not going to go through all of these, but we have taken Audubon's big ideas and sort of framed some of the big important areas where Arizona is going to focus. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time in conservation. I'm going to touch on public policy, but I want to spend just a moment here to talk about this collaboration. Audubon Arizona is in a whole bunch of different sort of collaborative programs and projects. Our work with chapters are fundamental to almost all of those. So when we talk about water policy, most of the chapters in Arizona are engaged with us on water policy. That's through our Western Rivers Action Network. We're also working to elevate some voices that are not as present as we hope they will be in conservation in Arizona. Think like our tribal work, our South Phoenix community, which is a historically underserved community. So we're working to elevate those voices as well. So the collaborative aspect of the work that we're doing is really important. This is our home. How many of you have been to the Nina Mason Pulliam Rio Salado Audubon Center? Great. So our state office is here and our center functions are here. That's not that common, I have learned, across the Audubon network of nature centers. But our whole team is housed together with 3 exceptions in, as I mentioned, the research ranch. So this gives us an opportunity to really kind of cross-pollinate. So our education programs are deeply embedded in our conservation work, and the kids that are with us on field trips are doing conservation while they're with us on the field trip. So it's actually a really great opportunity for us. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the Nature Center, but I want to make sure that you know that we have this whole suite of education programs there. We have field trips for K through 8th graders. We have an after-school program. We've had a summer camp program that actually came up here to Mingus Mountain for some of the camp. We give the kids an opportunity to get out of the desert heat, come up here and enjoy what you all enjoy in the summer. I want to mention our River Pathways program. This is a program for teens that is focused on giving kids information about conservation careers, and we've expanded it recently. We've had an influx of funding that our national team was able to direct to Arizona and to Texas to build in some leadership development for teens. So we think this is a great way to get kids who, particularly in the city, who don't have a lot of access to more remote places, get them out in the field and see themselves in some of the young teachers that we have who are our Mackenzie Fellows. So they see themselves in a 20-year-old college student and think, oh, there's a job in this kind of work. So it's a really great program. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time there, although I could go on all night. I also want to point out our Downtown Owls program because they are incredibly charismatic little birds. They are out during the day. You can't ask for much more than that when you have people coming to visit you. We have a partnership with Wild at Heart where burrowing owls that are being impacted by development are relocated. Our volunteers build new burrows for them at Rio Salado Habitat Restoration Area, which is the city park that we're on. And the owls are relocated, they're released. Some of them stay, some of them don't. We now have researchers who have come back to evaluate the effectiveness of this project. We are making some modifications in how it works out, and we're hoping that this science that we're gathering at this site is replicable across the country. So really wonderful work. We've had over 1,000 volunteers, over 1,000 volunteers who have worked on this project. So it's a great way to connect people to these really charismatic little birds. And our work at Rio Salado is growing. I want to spend just a minute here because I wouldn't have even included this slide until a conversation with our Northern Arizona Audubon Society chapter president. We were talking about Rio Reimagined, which is Senator McCain's sort of vision for what's next with this river that runs through Phoenix that most of Phoenix doesn't know is there. And how do we reconnect the city to its river? And as Dennis and I were talking, it occurred to us that most of our communities have a similar story. A water resource, a river, wetlands, that they've sort of turned their back on. If you look at Yuma, and any of you been to Yuma recently and seen sort of how they've reoriented themselves toward their river, toward the Colorado River? It's really remarkable. 25 years ago, it was not a place you wanted to spend time down on the river, but now it's greenways and parks and birding. And so Dennis and I have been talking about, is there something here as Phoenix in a sort of high-profile project starts to think about reorienting the city toward its river, is there an opportunity for us to use that as a model in other places? So I share this just to point out that even though it's Phoenix-centric, we think it is something that could be of use to other communities. So here's where it gets risky. I'm going to use the word strategic plan in a public presentation, which is always ill-advised, but I want to use Audubon's strategic plan as kind of an organizing framework for what we talk about tonight. This is a really, I came in as the strategic plan was being adopted. So I've been with Audubon for about 2.5 years. We are midway through a 5-year plan. I have been amazed at the fact that this is a living document. It's not something that sat on the shelf. Mine is dog-eared and written in. This is a document that Audubon is really using to guide its conservation work. So I think it's appropriate to give it a shot. And we're going to talk about these 5 strategic conservation priorities included in the plan. And you may look at that first one And you might think, really? She's going to talk about coastal conservation in Arizona tonight? But I am. I'm going there. So our coastal work is, as you might imagine, focused on the east and west coast, but Arizona plays a role here. So does anybody remember about a year and a half ago, there was a whole flurry of activity around Arctic National Wildlife Refuge? Audubon has been fighting to defend Arctic National Wildlife Refuge from drilling for over 40 years. And that work continues despite a bad vote in Congress about a year ago. Our work to protect Arctic continues. The birds that come from Arctic National Wildlife Refuge go to every state in the nation and every continent except Europe, oddly enough. So this is America's bird basket. Thus, we get involved in coastal conservation. The other reason is this one, Colorado River Delta. So Colorado River met the sea for the first time in 40 years, about 2014, so coming up on 5 years ago. And our work in water conservation is largely oriented around the Colorado River Basin, and where it meets the sea, our birds are also going there. I'm going to talk about the Yuma Ridgeways Rail in a moment. They put some transmitters on them and learned this year that they are actually moving down to Mexico. So there's much we don't know, but even what we do know, we know our birds are going to Mexico. So we care about the Delta too. So that's all I'm going to say about coasts nationally. There's a huge amount going on. They're particularly focused on forage fish for marine birds. But I'm going to move on to a second conservation strategy, which is our Working Lands program. So this is a cooperative project with landowners, ranch lands, farmlands, timberlands, particularly back east and in the Pacific Northwest. Why? Our grassland birds are one of the most at-risk group of species in the country, and that risk is only escalating as climate change impacts increase. So if we want to protect birds, we have to protect grasslands. Most of those grasslands are being managed as ranch land. So if we can partner with willing landowners to introduce bird-friendly practices on their ranch lands, we have developed a program to certify, grazed on Audubon-certified bird-friendly land. So this is an effort to introduce some land management activities that can support our grassland birds and develop a premium on the price for the ranchers who work with Audubon on that process. So you'll see it's not yet in Arizona. This was piloted several years ago. That 621,000 acres number is actually out of date. I think it's closer to 800,000 acres now. So the goal now is to really scale this work to have conservation impact at a scale that is really meaningful for grassland birds. So it's been a really exciting project for us. It's a little bit risky, as you can imagine. I mean, beef, you know, there's a fundamental concern with the climate and conservation impacts of beef. But the reality as a pragmatic conservation organization is if we can make a difference here, we can really make a difference for birds. So it always takes 2 clicks. So I mentioned Appleton Wattell Research Ranch. There are no cows on Appleton Wattell Research Ranch, ironically. The family actually removed cattle from the land in the 60s. They were sort of done ranching, but they weren't done with the land, and they wanted to see what happened. And as the landscape changed, and they were making their own estate plans for what was going to happen after they were gone, they brought in Audubon as a partner and conveyed about 1,000 acres of land directly to Audubon. We also manage about 7,000 other acres of land that are owned by the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Swift Land and Cattle Company, and the Nature Conservancy. And collectively, those acres have had cattle excluded on them since 1980. And so this is anathema, as you might imagine, in the ranching community in southeastern Arizona. It seemed like a waste, right? But as the data started to come off of this property, as researchers were brought in and they were looking at changes over time, what the ranching community realized is they were often being asked to meet a standard that we couldn't even meet on the research ranch without cows. So the ranching community has actually really come to embrace the research ranch as a partner, helping them sort of figure out what good management practices should be expected to deliver on the ground. So I was surprised to learn how much the ranching community has really embraced Appleton Whitell Research Ranch. It is also spectacularly beautiful. It's not a place that is open to the public. That's one of the limitations that the landowner put on it when the property was conveyed. But it is a place that organized groups can go to. So I don't know if you all plan field trips, but this is an option. There is housing there, researcher housing. It is not 4-star or 5-star, but it's comfortable, and it's a really remarkable place. All right, so third one. We're going to spend some time on this one. Third conservation strategy that Audubon is involved in across the country is water. And as you can imagine, in Arizona, all roads in conservation lead back to water. Did anyone see this report that came out last year, Water and Birds in the Arid West? Not many? Okay. Happy to share it. I didn't bring any copies, but you don't want a printed copy anyway. It's online. It's a synthesis of other people's research across the country related to riparian habitats. The focus was on the Colorado River Basin and saline lakes. So one of the most important things that actually came out of this report, that while it was a synthesis of existing data, this was one of the first times it really appeared in print as a stark reminder of how important this work is. The saline lakes are scattered from Salton Sea in California all the way up into Oregon. And what we realized through this process is that the birds that are using these resources use them as a system. They move around between them. If one is dry in one year, they'll switch to another one. So they have to be conserved as a system. It doesn't help them enough to conserve one at a time. We have to look at those saline lakes as a system. So that was a really important aspect of the work that Audubon did on this report. It also really escalated the investment Audubon put into our saline lakes conservation work. The other area where we spend a lot of time, and this is where Arizona comes in, is on the Colorado River Basin. So our Western Rivers Action Network is a multi-state effort. I will say I think Arizona has invested the most heavily in building this as a grassroots advocacy organization. We work with, I think every chapter in the state is involved in one way or another. We have a lot of hunter-angler partners. They care about these riparian habitats too. We have some businesses. We have a Western Rivers Brewers Council because beer is a great way to get people talking about conservation. So we work with brewers to reach their sort of community of customers, but they're worried about these issues too. They need clean water for their beer, and they want to be good community partners, so we work with brewers. So it's just a really diverse group of people, and it's really focused on action. So we have about 10,000 people in Arizona, and they opt in. This is not just our mailing list. This is a separate group of people who are really committed to water conservation issues. We have webinars. Well, here, I'll put the slide up. I'm going to go out of order. We have webinars and workshops. We do briefings for some of our organizational partners, so we'll bring in speakers to share information about water policy issues. We do advocacy alerts. It gets really wonky. When we're talking about the Colorado River, I mean, I don't know if anybody's paying any attention to what's in the press these days, but I mean, my eyes blur, and I'm doing this for a living. So one of the things that we really try to focus on is distilling this into what's really important and relevant and what matters for birds, right? That's what we're trying to communicate back out. So what do all these policy decisions that are being made right now, what do they mean for birds and for the habitats they need? So I'm going to go back here to what we're focused on. So the drought contingency plan, big crazy policy whirlwind right now, multi-state agreement on how we're going to share a shortage in the Colorado River Basin. So we know that the river is over-allocated, and we know that we're in a drought, and we know that that drought is probably really aridification, the long-term sort of drying of our environment, and with climate change, that's going to continue. So all of those things together necessitate all the states who use the Colorado River figuring out how to share this shortage. What are we going to do in this new reality? So we are focused on that because what we don't want to have happen is it to be a zero-sum game for birds. We're going to have the rivers dry. People will have enough, but we're going to dry the rivers. Like, that's not the calculus that we want to have happen here. So we have to participate in these really complex, wonky conversations to be a voice for birds and other wildlife. Minute 323 is an agreement, so it's not just in our country we have to work this out, but we're also sharing the river with Mexico. Mexico has actually agreed to allocate water for environmental restoration purposes if the US gets its house in order. So there's a real, I mentioned why we care about coastal issues. The Colorado River Delta, where our birds are going, is a place where we can invest in conservation that really benefits our birds, but we have to get our own house in order before Mexico will commit that additional water. We don't want to drain groundwater in order to make up this gap. So at the same time, it's like a multi-front effort, right? We're trying to make sure that we're also not just turning to groundwater, which is a finite resource, to make up this gap. So we have to all figure out how to work with less water. I'll leave out most of this other stuff. I want to focus on the on-the-ground conservation and restoration. There are a few key river corridors that are particularly important to birds. I know you're all familiar with the Verde River, the San Pedro River in southeastern Arizona, critically important for birds. Many of you have probably birded there. We bring up all the birds from Mexico right in through that corridor, so it's another place where we're really focused on making sure that adequate water continues to flow in those rivers. Santa Cruz through Tucson, primarily fed by effluent. So there's another issue we take up. How do we use our wastewater? Because the reality is there's no such thing as wastewater in Arizona. How can we use that to feed rivers? Crucially important already to Santa Cruz and will be for lots of other rivers as well. Lower Gila River I'm going to come back to, but that's one where we are particularly committed at Audubon, Arizona. Oh, I'm coming to it right there. So the Lower Gila River, Salt and Lower Gila come together just outside of town in Phoenix, and the Lower Gila has a population of Yuma Ridgway's rail. And so I'm using this as an example of sort of how all this craziness all comes together for us. We have a bird that is federally endangered. We have a riparian habitat that doesn't have enough water, as most of our riparian habitats don't. And we have resources associated with, I mentioned our River Pathways program and our Mackenzie Fellows, this conservation leadership development. We have some policy expertise. So the Lower Gila River is where we think those things are going to come together into a project that directly benefits Yuma Ridgway's rail, but also other birds that are marsh habitat dependent. So the goal here will be to replicate an existing model that another biologist has developed that will help us figure out the most important places for this bird. We're going to use the River Pathways and Mackenzie Fellow students to ground truth that. Is this really what the birds need? Does it really look like what the model says on the ground? We're going to use another group of fellows called the Dangerman Fellows, who are focused on GIS mapping, to put all of that information together. And then we're going to try to drive conservation dollars to do habitat restoration for that bird in that place. We're also going to use our water policy expertise to try to direct some water, permanent water, to these places. So we think that this is a model for how all of these little threads that Audubon Arizona is working on can come together for a particularly important bird. You can't ask for a much more charismatic bird unless you ask for one that actually made an appearance for people. So very good possibility no one who works on this project will actually see this bird. But hope springs eternal. All right. I'm going to take a breather. Any questions so far? We've been through 3 conservation strategies. I'm still in a strategic plan. Are you with me? Okay. Any questions yet? All right, let's move on to another big gnarly conservation issue. Climate. So Audubon has been engaged in climate work for, I think it's probably around 10 years now. It was fairly quiet at first, and it was largely oriented around this report. Our first approach to this as a sort of organization that uses science to guide our decision making was to figure out what the science actually was on predictions for how climate change was going to impact birds. And so the report came out in 2015, identified 314 birds that we believe are at significant risk due to climate change. What we call Climate 2.0 is actually expected out later this year, and that will overlay land use changes, anticipated land use changes on top of climate change, because our birds are grappling with both, right? If they have the ability to move to another location due to climate change, will there be land available for them with the suitable habitat? So we've got to put these two pieces of information together. Audubon's approach to climate change has been to focus on purple places. So we're not trying to convince conservatives of any kind that this is human-caused or not. We're trying to convince people that we can do things that build resiliency that are good regardless. We are trying to convince people that their elected officials, for example, that their constituents care about this, and they should too, whether they believe the science or not. This is an issue that we can all make a difference on, and we don't have to come to agreement on every aspect of climate change. So we are also using the fact, I mentioned that Audubon is local everywhere. What do local communities, what are they concerned about around climate change? For us in Arizona, a lot of it comes back to water. Climate change is drought and aridification in Arizona. That's not true everywhere. Other places, our coastal communities, that's not what they're worried about. So we can localize climate in a way that is really powerful. So one of the things that we're doing, is Prescott Audubon involved in Climate Watch? No. So this is a program, we have had a hard time driving it actually because we don't have the birds. It's focused on nuthatches and bluebirds. And so in the valley, we don't have those birds frequently enough to do this, but northern Arizona I know is doing it, and Tucson Audubon is doing it up in the mountains. The idea is that you monitor these particular birds over time and engage the community in a conversation about what's happening to them over time and use that to sort of introduce this idea of climate change. Dennis Tomko, again, from Northern Arizona, they recently started working with NAU on Climate Watch, and what they found was it wasn't the birds that were a draw, it was the climate engagement. So they're actually engaging college student new birders by talking about climate. We all thought that we were going to engage birders, existing birders, to talk about climate. It's the reverse for some of these college students. So it's an interesting approach to engagement of that demographic as well. All right, fifth conservation strategy, bird-friendly communities. We're going to spend a little bit of time here too. I had to use that one. We don't get these guys in the desert very often. You guys have them. But I'm from Indiana. That's like my home bird. So I was so excited to be able to use a robin slide. So the goal with bird-friendly communities is to make the places where people live also appealing and usable for birds. So your Feed the Feeder program, great example of that. So I want to talk for just a minute about native plants. Have you heard about the Plants for Birds program and the database that you can search? Some of you, okay. So I want to talk for just a minute about why we talk about native plants as opposed to just, any green plant. And 2 clicks, Sonia. I'm going to use the Rufous hummingbird as an example. So this little bird migrates over the course of the year, starts out going up the coast in the spring, back down through the mountains in the fall. Most of us love seeing it, and this is what that bird is really hoping to see, right? When it's traveling, it needs food, lots of flowers, looks pretty lush, but often this is what they see instead. So if you were traveling and you're that tiny little bird, and you need to fuel up, that's pretty daunting, right? And then you add on top of that, what's happening, I mentioned the climate report from 2015. This is some of the data that came out of that. As you move through time, the suitable habitat for that bird is shifting. And so it's even harder to figure out where to go to just get a meal, right? And then you add this. What percentage of land birds feed their chicks primarily insects? C, I hear C. Yeah, you guys are way ahead of me on this. Even hummingbirds. It's not just nectar when they're feeding young. They're feeding a slurry of crushed up bugs and nectar too. And 90% of the insects that eat plants can only eat the plants with which they've co-evolved. They can only eat the local native plants. So if you want to support birds in your home, add native plants to your landscape. It's not an all or nothing prospect. You don't have to rip everything out. Just start incorporating some native plants. So we have used this as another way to connect people to birds. And the Plants for Birds database, you can all go to the National Audubon website. This database is featured pretty prominently. You can plug in your zip code. You can get a list of plants. You can also search for the birds you want to attract and find plants that will attract them. It's been a great resource. The last I heard, the average person going to this database is spending 14 minutes there. So think about what that means. That's a long time. They're spending some time figuring out what plants they can put in their yard to support birds. Okay, those are our 5 conservation strategies. You still with me? Okay, so we have 4 pillars. I'm gonna go through those too. Oh my gosh, she's really committed to this strategic plan thing. This matters though. We have a centrist voice. When we talk about public policy, or as it's framed in our strategic plan, building durable public will, this is the one part of our plan I don't love. I call it get her done, because I lived in North Carolina for 11 years. So we are a moderate and pragmatic organization. We do not typically engage in all or nothing black or white issues. We're trying to carve out this centrist path. And this is why we have a significant proportion of our supporters who consider themselves to be moderates or conservatives. So that gives us amazing access to talk about conservation we're not preaching to the choir. It's a really remarkable makeup for a nonprofit conservation organization. And so we have leveraged some of that kind of bipartisan aspect of our work to engage on a number of things. We consider it to be places where we're playing offense and playing defense. And I'm not going to go through each of these, but I think it's important to realize, particularly on the defense side, you'll hear Audubon pop up with issues like defending the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, 100-year anniversary of this, what we consider to be a bedrock conservation legislation. It is fundamental to protecting birds. The Endangered Species Act, fundamental to protecting birds. So when you see Audubon with a call to action, it has been, we are not playing whack-a-mole. We are being very strategic about where and how we engage, and we're using the lens of birds to do it. So I hope when you see our action alerts, you'll keep that in mind and take action on them. Second pillar, science. We are a science-driven organization, so we use the community science. You all participate in the Christmas bird count. Did you participate in the Western Rivers bird count? Anybody do that one? That's a brand new one we just rolled out this spring, but we're going to do it again. It's to help fill gaps in data that we have across the country associated with our western riparian habitats. I mentioned Climate Watch, Backyard Bird Count. We use this data. We're doing the Yuma Ridgeways rail work now because of marsh bird surveys and our access to that kind of information. And I just want to point out again, leveraging our expertise and our resources with these Mackenzie Fellows and Dangerman Fellows, and really connecting people to conservation that has impact. Western Rivers bird count I just mentioned. I want to point out though, 100 new eBird reports. So these are new sites where we had 0 data before the Western Rivers bird count. So when we think about figuring out what places are really important for birds, this is a really great way for us to do that. Also landed on the paper, which was helpful. And the important bird areas, which I know you all are committed to. Important bird areas are a great way for us to connect local communities to important places for birds. So we have 48 sites now. Forgive me, the map is wrong. There's only 46 on there, but I haven't updated my map. But we have 48 sites. 2/3 of those are directly tied to riparian habitat. So this is why when we say all roads in conservation lead back to water, that's why. I mentioned earlier Audubon being local everywhere and the power of our network, but you all are a reflection of that. 1 million people come through the nature centers across the country, and those are just the ones that National Audubon runs. There are chapter-run centers as well. Think about the people we're able to reach with bird conservation information through that. So Audubon is really investing in these places, in this reach, because it's how we influence bird conservation across the country. We also know that we don't have all of the right people in the room. So we are committed to elevating voices who are not there. It means that sometimes when I'm in meetings in South Phoenix, I'm talking about gentrification and displacement and things that don't seem directly connected to birds, but really are when we're an authentic partner with our South Phoenix community. So the way that we engage around bringing new voices to the conversation is really important for our relevance. So I think that this is a crucial investment for Audubon. It is central to everything that we're doing. And then the last thing I want to share is Year of the Bird. I think most of the chapters have engaged on this in one way or another, but 2018 has been deemed Year of the Bird because of the 100th anniversary of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And Governor Ducey declared, they don't declare whole years, so we had Year of the Bird Day, which is slightly confusing. Nonetheless, we'll take it. It's every day is Year of the Bird, so we'll take whatever day they're willing to designate. City of Phoenix, the mayor has also signed a Year of the Bird proclamation. City of Tucson has. So it's just been a good way for us to talk in a, it's not confrontational, it's not controversial, it's just a way to celebrate how much birds mean to our communities. At the same time, it's been in every National Geographic issue over the course of the year. It's a partnership with National Geographic, Cornell, Audubon, and I'm forgetting somebody, there's a fourth one. Sorry about that. But it's been a really fun year for us. It's been a great way for us to organize our conversations around birds. Okay, how'd I do on time? All right, so I have time for questions? All right, you hung with me through a strategic planning conversation. Thank you. Okay, I'm happy to take questions. Yeah. Uh-huh. Lots of invasives. Layman's love grass. The ranch director will kill me for not thinking of the other ones, but yes, lots of invasives, and that's been the most challenging thing for us to manage. No, it has been fire impacted, which is natural there, and so that has helped with the woody vegetation in many places. The mesquite is a challenge in some places, hasn't been as much for the ranch as far as I understand. The invasive grasses are the biggest challenge. Yeah. Yep.
This is from a high level of ignorance, but I've read 2 or 3 times about some potential very serious concerns about insect populations worldwide. Is anyone trying to understand that issue?
You mean in terms of like pesticides and how they impact native insects?
Vegetation, climate, whatever.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Many of the same challenges that our birds face associated with climate change, our insect populations are also facing, our plant populations are facing. So there are some daunting challenges ahead. There are some challenges, everybody's probably heard about the neonicotinoids and bees, and so one of the things that we have also been somewhat active on is not just encouraging native plants, but they have to be pesticide-free native plants in that application, because what you don't want is somebody to plant native plants, nuke it so it doesn't have any insects on it, and then wonder why they don't have birds. So these things are all linked together. But yeah, all those same challenges, climate impacts and drought, all apply to other species as well. Absolutely. Yep.
On the ranch, historically, there was probably large stuffed animals there, like buffalo maybe, a long time ago, or antelope.
Yeah.
And the removal of cattle that maybe kind of mimics some of that large stuffed animal behavior. Are there large stuffed animals on the ranch?
No, there are not. I will say, I think, and I wish Tice was here because she would know, for those of you who know Tice Saplee, my understanding is that they suspect that that wasn't actually a habitat that had the large hoofed mammals like the bison. We are a little bit outside of that range. Our grasslands consequently function quite a bit differently, which is one of the reasons we have not yet brought the conservation ranching program to Arizona, because in some ways, bird-friendly beef in the Great Plains, you can mimic those hoofed animals and move them as they used to move, and that gets you part of the way toward bird-friendly beef. You can't necessarily just lay that over our grasslands because they were different. I don't know about this geography, if that same thing holds true, but for the southern Arizona grasslands, it's not exactly replicable. Yep.
For your research center, your owls,
Yeah.
your location, are those birding field trip friendly? Could we as a Audubon
Come to visit the owls? Yes. We would love for you to come and visit the owls. Yes, they are. The challenge is, so if you go as a small group, you will almost always see owls. If you go as a large group, they will almost always go in their burrows. So good idea to maybe spread out. There are 5 different sites that have owls at Rio Salado, so you could break a group up and go to 5 different places to try to increase your odds. We just had, Kathy and I had a conversation today about adding a birds and bikes program and taking people on bikes down to see the owls. And we were like, well, will they be disappointed if they don't see owls? So we may actually couple it with our live animal programs on Saturday. So if they don't see them out there, they'll see them in the nature center. So you might be able to make a trip. If we get that program off the ground, you could really make a trip of it. Yes, yeah, you can, I've got some cards here, and I'll give you my card. You can email me, or any one of our staff can connect you. But we have information about the owls at the center, so you can just walk in and get a brochure with a map of where they're located. If you wanted one of our staff to take you, though, and talk about the relocation, just let us know. We'd be happy to do that. Yep.
Is there any kind of a native grass restoration when we're closing?
There is. So the former director who retired last year after 17 years with us, she was a grassland ecologist. So her focus had been on what would work at the research ranch. The problem has been scaling it. So there are places where they can keep the invasives out, keep the natives in, or add natives, but the problem has been scaling it for 8,000 acres. So that's probably true for a lot of restoration work, making it scale. Yep.
I have one question. Have you heard of success stories either in Arizona or national to get tentacles into the younger generation and really know how to bonds form?
Yeah, that's a great question, toward Audubon specifically. So I'll share 2 things that I've heard recently, and they're sort of related. So I mentioned Northern Arizona having worked with Northern Arizona Audubon, having worked with Northern Arizona University, and finding that the climate watch was compelling not because of the birds, but because of the climate. That, for me, has changed a lot about how I think about how we engage with younger audiences. They were just waiting. I mean, what I heard from Northern Arizona was that the NAU students were just waiting to have a way to take action on climate. So I think it's important to think about that, give people an opportunity to make a difference. And it wasn't the birds that brought them in, it was the making a difference that did. So that has changed a little bit about how I think about some of this work. We have a Birds and Beer program every month. Don't underestimate the power of a good local brew. Or coffee, I mean, I think about that too. You know, just, I think ways to bring people together in our increasingly kind of phone-oriented world, opportunities to come together and have conversation that is informal, maybe single subject oriented or something like that. National Audubon is launching an effort to connect with colleges and universities, and to connect those. At first, some of us were concerned, oh, they're starting college chapters, but that's not it. They're trying to connect those college students to local chapters. That's a new program that's not fully fleshed out yet, but I think will have some potential for chapters across the country, and that's why they're thinking about it, because it's something, they can get it right, they can provide it, you know, help chapters everywhere figure out how to make use of that. And you all are really well positioned for that because you have access to colleges. So, conservation work days have been a big one for us, for young people. So we, again, the idea of give them an opportunity to make a difference. So we have volunteer projects that we've done. Some of it, sometimes it's building burrows. Last weekend, they did work planting native plants in our gardens and on our grounds. So lots of different things, but action has been the focus. Off the top of my head, those are. Anybody else? Thank you again for having me.